Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. And thank you, Professor Harris, for joining us. I'm just going to say a quick line about Belongg and what we do before we launch into today's session. So Belongg seeks to make services, spaces, knowledges available to people who otherwise face discrimination on the basis of identity. So gender, sexuality, race, caste, ethnicity, disability, etc. And the book club and library in particular is invested in exploring books along with their authors that focus on themes of diversity and inclusion. So we're very excited to have Professor Harris here with us today. And just to quickly introduce him, which is slightly weird to do given that I'm sure many of you know him already. But Professor Harris is Professor of English at Ashoka University. He was also the founding dean. And of course, he's written a lot of books. Incredibly prolific author. Most recently, he published Misala Shakespeare with a Left Book Company in 2018. But today we're actually here to discuss his earlier works, which I don't think any of us have heard you speak about before, so that should be interesting. And of course, it's such a timely topic as well on pandemics and xenophobia. So we're really excited that you could be here with us today. And over to you.
Thank you, Manjari, and thank you everyone for coming out on a Friday night. Not that there is a whole lot else to do on a Friday night these days, but here we are. And here I am, confronted with two rather disconcerting mirror images of myself. One is on the laptop screen in front of me, and the other is the spectre of two books: Foreign Bodies and the Body Politic, Discourses of Social Pathology in Early Modern England. The first book I published, it was my doctoral dissertation. I completed it in 1990, and a few years later it came out as a book. And then a few years later, shortly after 9/11, I published this book, Sick Economies, Drama, Mercantilism and Disease in Shakespeare's England. It's a little bit strange to come back to these books because for the longest time I'd always regarded them as sort of part of my juvenilia. They're books that I feel a little bit distant from because my work has taken a very different direction in the last 20 or so years. And also because I've moved location since I wrote them. I wrote Foreign Bodies and the Body Politic, or most of it in England, and I wrote Sick Economies in America. And of course, I'm now living in a very different world. So are we all. And in this new world, not only is past prologue, as Shakespeare says, past might also be our epilogue as well, the place to which we return. So clearly, early on in my career as an author, I was obsessed with disease. And I was obsessed with disease not because I was a hypochondriac, and not because, coming from a Jewish family, my parents had always hoped that I would become a doctor at some point. And eventually I did become a doctor, just not the kind of doctor that my mother hoped I would be. She was still referring to me as her son, the doctor, after I got my PhD. But I think there's a way in which turning to questions of disease in my doctoral work back in England had to do with this expectation from my family that I should be concerned with matters of health. But it also had a lot more to do with other prevailing factors that were in the air in the late 80s, and for that matter into the 90s and the early noughts in America as well. I'd grown up in New Zealand, a very, very small country, I think an exceptionally naive country. And in New Zealand, we had a strong sense that home was elsewhere. This was not just because my parents were immigrants, but also because I was the child of a colonial culture. All our cultural reference points, at least for white settler New Zealanders like me, were British. despite the fact that I'm not British at all. I grew up with British music. I grew up with British theatre. I grew up with British TV. I grew up with British literature in particular. And so when I got a scholarship to study at the University of Sussex in Britain, some naive part of me thought, I'm coming home. After 23 years of exile in New Zealand, I'm finally returning to the ancestral home, despite the fact that I had no ancestors in Britain. Very quickly, I realized how bizarre and how ill-conceived that particular fantasy was. Because for the first time in my life, I was being reminded with alarming regularity virtually every day that I was a foreigner. And the casual racism of not only sort of random people in pubs and on the street, but even in the seminar room, where people would hear my accent. And I was giving a presentation, say, on Roman Jakobson and structuralism. And the instructor of record, I won't mention their name, but they're quite a famous person, stopped me at the end of my presentation. And I was expecting this instructor to say, interesting point. Instead, they said, where's that accent from? Australia? South Africa? So all the time I was being reminded of the fact that I was a foreigner. And I got interested in how foreignness was not a transparent category. It was part of a narrative that had to be produced and performed over and over again. Basically drafting certain people to fill the role of the foreigner in order to perform certain compulsions to narrate oneself as belonging, in this case to Britain or to the seminar room or to the discourse of critical theory or whatever. And although I'd gone to England to write, believe it or not, about Chaucer and medieval ideas of carnival, I found my work drifting more and more into the early modern period and to ideas of the foreign. And I was reading a number of texts that would help me understand something of the history of performing the identification of foreignness. We could call it the history of xenophobia if you want, but I wanted to understand it as more than simply a phobic response, as a compulsion that produced something else in its trail. And I started reading early medical texts. And I found myself more and more realizing that during the 16th century, a massive change happened in the way in which people thought about disease and foreigners. And these two categories of disease and foreigners were in fact intimately related. So let me explain what I discovered. First of all, up to about probably 1500 in Europe, there really wasn't a very clear conception of disease as a foreign body. There couldn't be because the microscope hadn't been invented. There wasn't yet a discourse, a science of microbiology. No one knew about bacterias or viruses or small organisms, germs. Germ, in fact, in the early 16th century simply meant a seed. A farmer went out and planted germs in order to grow his or her crops. Now, there were two sort of basic ideas of what a disease was and what caused it. One derived from religion. And the idea was that disease was fundamentally a punishment for sin. If you were a sinner, God would strike you down with a disease, with leprosy or with plague. The word plague, in fact, comes from the Latin word plaga, which means a strike. The idea being that God strikes down the sinful and the wicked with disease. Against the religious notion of disease was something a little bit more thought through, which we could call a medical idea of disease. And it derived from Greek and Roman tradition, and is associated in particular with the thought of a very important physician named Galen. Galen was in the Greco-Roman tradition about 2,000 years ago, and he theorized that every human body is a mixture of 4 different fluids, which he called the humours. The humours consisted of, number 1, blood, the red fluid; number 2, choler, the yellow fluid. This is nice and psychedelic. Number 3, phlegm, the green fluid; and number 4, melancholy, the black fluid. Each of us, according to Galen, have these fluids in some kind of mixture, but each person has a slightly different blend of the 4 ingredients, and their personality is a result of what Galen called their complexion, which was the Latin term for mixture, the mixture of the humours. Now, your skin reflected your complexion. If you had a predominance of blood as your major humour, you'd be ruddy, red-cheeked. If you had a predominance of choler, the yellow fluid, you would be jaundiced. If you had a predominance of phlegm, you'd be slightly green and sallow. And too much melancholy, you'd be black. This was, in fact, Galen's explanation of why Africans had darker skins. He said they had a preponderance of the black melancholy humour. Now, as you can tell from the word melancholy, Galen also argued that the mix of fluids, the complexion of humours, affected your personality, your emotional disposition. An excess of blood meant that you would be merry. The word was sanguine. We still use the word sanguine to mean good-humoured. It's interesting that we use the word humid. It comes from humoral medicine. To be sanguine is to be good-humoured, to have blood, to have red, rosy cheeks. Choler in Latin also meant anger. So if you had the yellow fluids, too much jaundice, you'd be angry, choleric. If you had too much phlegm, you'd be phlegmatic, which means you'd be damp, a pathetic little squib. Too much melancholy, you'd be sad all the time. Shakespeare was very interested in this explanation of the body and moods. And Hamlet, for instance, is a classic study of humoral melancholy. He wears black all the time, not just because he's mourning the death of his father and the hasty remarriage of his mother, not just because he's some 32-year-old arrested teen in some goth emo permanent state, but because, according to Shakespeare's explanation, he is in the grip of melancholy. He suffers too much from the melancholy humour. Now, what does this have to do with disease? According to Galen, if your humours were out of balance, what he called the state of dyscrasia, and our word crazy is related to it, then you were diseased. You were ill if your humours were out of balance, out of whack. And so every disease, he explained, as an excess of this humour or a deficiency of that humour, etc. So even a disease like the plague, I mean, he didn't know the bubonic plague, that was a later disease, but there were earlier plagues that passed through the Mediterranean. He thought of plague, for instance, as an excess of melancholy. And this was the idea that lasted for close to 1700 years in Europe. There are similar notions, of course, that we find in Eastern medicine as well. In China and India, the idea that the body is a mixture of various elements and that we need to restore harmony and balance to the body to be healthy is an idea that is familiar to most people in the subcontinent. It's actually not that far-fetched an idea either. And most folk medicines attempted to deal with disease by trying to restore balance of some kind to the body. Ayurvedic medicine does much the same thing, so does Chinese medicine. But things began to change in around 1500 in Europe and in particular in Britain. For the first time, people started confronting pandemics that they couldn't explain. They tried to explain them according to the old mechanisms, but they didn't quite work. The pandemic that really tested people's ability to explain what a disease was a new disease that broke out shortly after Columbus came back from America. And it's quite possible that Columbus brought it back with him from America. That disease is syphilis. And syphilis, you think COVID is bad. Syphilis in its earliest incarnation swept like wildfire through Europe and much of the rest of the world. At one point in England, it's believed that 70% of people had syphilis. It was also immensely fatal. The HIV crisis from the 80s, 90s into the 21st century seems fairly minor for all the trauma it induced. It seems fairly minor simply in terms of the percentage of people that it has killed. Syphilis wiped out a huge number of the European population. And those who didn't die of syphilis carried it and passed it on, often to the next generation. Some of the symptoms of syphilis included baldness and failing eyesight. It's interesting that Shakespeare, in his early portraits, has a full head of curly hair. His most famous portrait from the first folio of his works, he's completely bald and he's squinting a bit. And people have wondered, why did he suddenly stop writing in about 1613? Well, if you look closely at the imagery of his plays, you'll see that starting in about 1600, about the time he wrote Hamlet, the plays are full of metaphors related to disease and syphilis. It's quite possible Shakespeare, like 70% of the population, contracted it. Now, what I found interesting is that something that had already started happening a few years earlier with plague and leprosy, two other pandemic diseases that had swept through Europe, began to happen with syphilis. And that was that people started to blame others, and in particular other communities, for the appearance of the disease. Although plague was blamed on God's will to punish a sinful population, people started saying, the Jews, they've been poisoning the wells. That's why we're getting plague. We're being poisoned by them. Leprosy, which swept through Europe. Again, people said, Jews, they're poisoning the well with something else. And this tendency to blame other communities, to blame foreigners for diseases, became even more pandemic, as it were, when the syphilis pandemic spread. I'm just going to read you one extract from Foreign Bodies and the Body Politic about what happened with syphilis. So there was a panoply of names devised for syphilis in the early years of the 16th century. Names are destiny. And these names demonstrate how virtually every nation where people were afflicted by the disease assumed the disease to have its origins in another nation, another body politic. The Russians referred to the disease as the Polish sickness. The Poles called it the German sickness. The Germans called it the French sickness, a term of which the English also approved. They called it the French pox. So did the Italians. The Flemish and the Dutch called it the Spanish sickness. and so did the inhabitants of northwest Africa. The Portuguese called it the Castilian sickness, whilst the Japanese and the people of the East Indies came to call it the Portuguese sickness. Both popularly and scientifically, syphilis came to be understood as residing in and being transmitted by foreign bodies. So what I argued in Foreign Bodies and the Body Politic was that all of a sudden in the 16th century, we have what looks like a scientific advance. That for the first time, people are recognizing that epidemic diseases, pandemic diseases, are not caused by God punishing people. They're not caused simply by humoral imbalance inside the body. They're caused by invading foreign bodies. But this seeming scientific advance, which we would now recognize from our vantage point as much closer to a modern microbiological conception of disease, was at root fueled by deep xenophobia. That the impulse to blame foreign communities for diseases that were otherwise inexplicable helped fuel a revolution that then disguised its origins as being xenophobic, right? So what looks like a scientific, objective step forward is rooted in some of the most primally aggressive, hateful forms of human interaction. Now, when I came to write my second book, Sick Economies, I'd started thinking about a number of other phenomena in the wake of the appearance of an idea of foreign bodies as being the vector of disease. By then, 9/11 had happened, and I was particularly struck by how what had unfolded in Shakespeare's England was unfolding all over again in George Bush's America. You may not realize it, you may not have the historical memory to understand that in the aftermath of 9/11, America went completely hysterical, I'd say even collectively psychotic. And one of the expressions of the mass hysteria was a conviction that Americans were about to be infected by chemical and biological weapons. Let me read out an extract from the epilogue of Sick Economies. And although I'm talking about 2001, you may notice certain resonances with our current pandemic moment. In the immediate aftermath of the attack on the World Trade Center, the New Yorker characterized the hijackers who crashed planes into the two towers as lethal viruses, that targeting the monuments to global capitalism, quote, rode the flow of the world's aerial circulatory system. This was a version of economic pathology, in which the foreign was stigmatized in order to naturalize the global. And what do I mean by that? The two towers may have fallen under attack by lethal Middle Eastern terrorists, but the circulatory system that conveyed these viruses to their targets remained intact. In other words, these foreign bodies came from abroad to infect America, but what remains intact is this entire global system of transnational commodity exchange, powered, interestingly, by the airways. Now, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there were two pandemic scares, one driven by a fear of the disease anthrax, and the other by the disease smallpox. Anthrax had been sent out in envelopes to various famous people in America. And it turned out that the person who did it was an American. But for several months, his identity was unknown. And everyone was speculating that it was Osama bin Laden or Muslim terrorists looking to infect the American body politic with anthrax, right? At the same time, rumors started circulating that Iraq was planning to launch bioweapons with smallpox attached to them. And smallpox, again, is an aerially transmitted disease like anthrax. You get it by breathing in the microbes. So people started panicking like crazy. So this is the part I'm going to read. The anthrax and smallpox scares of 2001 to 2003 underlined how foreign bodies conflated ideas of disease and ideas of foreigners. Unlike early modern humoral understandings of anthrax, Galen described anthrax as a carbuncle which doth come from some evil humour, or of smallpox, he says. Smallpox emerges from the hot and slimy blood of menstruating women. Can you believe? That's Galen. Now, in 2001 to 2003, both diseases were regarded as archetypes of an aerially transmitted foreign body. In the last months of 2001, US media fears focused on how finely milled anthrax bacteria can be released into the atmosphere by crop dusters or circulated through public ventilation systems. Likewise, in 2002, as mass inoculations of US health workers against smallpox began, everyone seems to have forgotten this now, the media started warning against a revival of the seemingly once extinct variola virus, which causes smallpox by being absorbed through the respiratory tract. Everyone was advised to wear masks. Because of both diseases' association with the threat of foreign bioterror, despite the fact that the US has been the world's largest producer of weapons-grade anthrax, each disease came to be doubly coded as invasive. Hence, as Americans fretted about inhaling virulent viruses or spores, the news network speculated incorrectly, as it transpired, about a possible Iraqi source for the anthrax contained in the letters sent to NBC News anchor Tom Brokaw and Senators Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. And as the Bush administration geared up for war with Saddam Hussein in 2003, and this was a vital part of its case for going to war, was the fear of an imminent smallpox invasion by Iraq and America. The Bush administration entertained the possibility of attack from al-Qaeda terrorists dispatched to unleash aerial payloads of the smallpox virus or nerve gas. Sales of duct tape with which to seal cracked windows and troublesome gaps under doors soared. There was mass panic buying at the supermarkets in America to buy duct tape, not toilet paper, but duct tape. Air, or at least air from the outside, had become a source of pathopanic. In other words, a virus could morph into a terrorist could morph into a virus, and both were coded as Muslim. It's amazing that 17 years after I wrote this, thinking that I was writing about something that had been to a certain extent laid to rest, it's all of a sudden eerily resonant. I'm not discounting that disease is spread through vectors like viruses or bacteria. To the contrary, it's important that we know how diseases are spread in order to understand them better. But if we don't understand the dark history in which ideas of disease as foreign bodies are twinned with ideas of actual people as disease-carrying foreign bodies, foreigners as spreaders of disease, then we can easily fall prey once again to a pathopanic in which a virus like corona suddenly becomes hashtag corona jihad, where the poor people, no matter how irresponsible they may have been, at the Nizamuddin gathering, become a synecdoche for an entire disease and an entire nation's experience of it. Despite the fact that people of all communities have been infected by coronavirus, have carried the coronavirus, have spread the coronavirus, it has become increasingly, as events, horrible events, unfolding in Defense Colony right now have made quite clear. I don't know whether you know about this, but a Chowkidar, a Muslim Chowkidar, was accused of having spread the coronavirus that tragically infected two of the people at whose house he worked, one of whom has died and one of whom is on a ventilator. He has turned out to be coronavirus negative, but only after an FIR was filed against him. And the police announced that he was on the run, even though he was just in lockdown in his apartment in Okla. I think now is a very good time for us to think once again about how discourses of foreign bodies in the scientific realm, the supposedly scientific realm, often carry an underbelly of xenophobia. And we need to make sure that our attempts to stay healthy and protect ourselves from the most noxious effects of virus and bacteria don't turn into pogroms against people who, in hysterical fashion, we damn as carriers of disease. I'm quite happy now to host questions, to think out loud with you, and to hear from Manjari.
Yeah, no, that was incredible. And of course, really drove home just how resonant your work is even today, and in all likelihood will be for quite a while to come. I mean, we can hope for the best, certainly. I had a question, but before I get into that, I just want to invite everyone to feel free to use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen to send in your questions. I see we've already gotten one question, so I'll weave that in, but keep sending in your questions and they'll become part of our conversation. So the question I had to you was about the idea of the vaccine, the idea that we need to ingest a small portion of the disease germ, so to speak, and in order to become immune to or desensitize ourselves to infection from stronger versions of that germ. And so how does that idea of the vaccine come in around that period that you're speaking about? Because I know the vaccine was developed significantly later, right? Sometime in the 1700s or towards the end of the 1700s.
Yeah.
So what are sort of the beginnings of that idea, if you were able to find any?
Well, the word vaccine is very interesting. It's actually related to the French word vache, which means cow. And doctors noticed that cowgirls, milkmaids who milk cows, weren't coming down with smallpox the way that the general population were. And they figured out that there was something in what the cowgirls were being exposed to that made them immune. And it turned out that cows were carrying sort of related form of smallpox that was not deadly. But if humans took on board the cow version of the virus, they would acquire immunity against the smallpox virus, the variola virus as well. Mm-hmm. So that's when the vaccine was scientifically discovered. But in fact, as you rightly point out, Manjari, ideas like the vaccine have a long prehistory. And my early research was also partly about the history of the idea of the vaccine, that by taking on board a certain amount of foreignness, a certain amount of a foreign body deemed as pathological, you actually strengthened rather than diminished the body's capacities. You actually find ideas like this dating back to antiquity. You find them in the subcontinent, you find them again in China. There are, of course, two very powerful strands in medicine. Allopathic medicine presumes, and Galen is an example of allopathic medicine, that you treat an illness with its opposite. So if you're burning with a fever, according to Galen, you put ice on a person in order to bring their fever down. If someone has too much blood, then you give them the equivalent of phlegm, something that isn't rich, in order to diminish their excess, right? Now, as opposed to this allopathic medicine, there have been homeopathic medicine, homeopathic medical practices all around the world, where the idea is you drive out a disease not with its contrary, but with a version of itself. The basic principle of homeopathy is that you take into your body a small amount of what is troubling the body. This is the principle of modern homeopathic medicine in Europe and in Germany, which has become very popular in India. But there are also Indian versions of it as well. You find versions of it, for instance, in Unani medicine and so on. But in the 16th century, in Germany in particular, a physician named Paracelsus is the character with whom we most associate this idea of homeopathic medicine. He proposed that poisons need to drive out poisons. And although this was a very radical idea that the Galenic establishment were quite upset by, he was drawing in large part on established folk remedies, but also on ideas that were very much part of European linguistic tradition. Those of you who are Ashoka students who struggled through the literary theory course may remember Derrida's essay on the pharmacon, in which he points out that the Greek word for poison, pharmacon, is also the Greek word for medicine. And that's because in Greek practice, poisons were often medicines. It's the same in German. The word gift means gift, as it does in English, but it also means poison. So in a lot of languages, the idea that what is dangerous for you can also be a remedy, a gift, or a medicine is quite strongly encoded. Now, interestingly, Paracelsus's idea that the best way to treat a disease is to give you a little bit more of the disease became part of political discourse too. So you found heads of state saying the best way to drive out violence is to administer violence. The best way of fighting war is with war. So again, what we might think of as an enlightened alternative medical practice, some of us might, could often have fairly dangerous applications in when metaphorically applied to the field of political statecraft. But Paracelsus's ideas remained sort of largely batty and obscure through much of the 17th century. They were denounced. Galen still remained fairly dominant. But as ideas of foreign bodies came in more and more, people began to think we need to combat foreign bodies with foreign bodies. Here's a really bizarre example of the pathologization of disease as foreign bodies and other people who were foreign bodies, meeting Paracelsus's ideas of treating a disease with the poison. Comes into play in the 17th century in England, where it was decided to readmit Jews to England. They'd been banished from England for about 400 years. Because they were believed to be anti-Christian, believed to poison wells, to plot against Christians, the usual nonsense. But it was believed that we need to import Jews into England to save England from the disease of untrammeled usury. Usury was regarded by Christians as a sin. Usury is, of course, the practice of lending money and charging interest. And a lot of Christians were doing it. And so moral and political authorities were saying, this is terrible, we can't have this. But at the same time, they needed people to lend money in England to bankroll all these new ventures, especially abroad. The East India Company was always needing loans for its activities, often nefarious, in places like Madras and soon Calcutta. So what was the solution? Bring in a few Jews to stop the Christians from practicing usury. We can let the Jews lend us money. So a small amount of poison will inoculate the English body politic against the sin of usury. We can still continue to blame the Jews for the sin that we're making them commit, but we'll be safe, and that's the important thing.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly interesting. And now I'm just going to start weaving the stuff that people are saying in. So before I get into the questions, Anupriya says, I hope you don't mind me sharing this, Anupriya. This is brilliant. I'm flipping. I had no idea about the historical correlation of xenophobia with disease.
Yep.
Thank you for that. Our first question, which was sent quite early on, was by Kaveri, and then she sent something else after. So Kaveri says, could the wanting to identify accents be more a compulsion to classify and put people under tags rather than any form of othering people? So the question of classification versus othering. A building up of tags. It's only when a skin color or physical difference adds to that the othering becomes more apparent. Yeah.
Well, I don't know about that. Certainly the impulse to order and make sense is not something that any of us can shake off. As soon as we enter into language, we're ordering the world. We're classifying it by virtue of the nouns that our language gives us. But I think the desire to classify people and the desire to other, there's a very, very thin membrane between the two, and I'm not sure that we can distinguish them with absolute certitude. I mean, think about the, if you like, hegemonic archetypal text of classification, the Manusmriti, which lays out in agonizing systematic detail all the workings of caste. It's hard to see that simply as an act of classificatory description. We can see there that the desire to classify and the desire to other really walk hand in hand. And I think the real challenge is how can we think in ways that recognize that people aren't the same as us, that doesn't pin them to an identity that comes with it a set of assumptions that de facto otherize them. And as much as we might lament the othering, religious, caste-based, gender-based, class-based, religion-based, that is pandemic in the subcontinent and around the world, it's a practice that all of us repeat in some way, no matter how much we disavow racism or casteism or sexism. The impulse to other is there, and I think what we have to do is dig a lot deeper and put pressure on this impulse we have to classify, to make lists, to think that we know on the basis of a label, a noun. I always think nouns are the most dangerous parts of speech that we have, because nouns create the illusion of fixity. Noun comes from the Latin word for to name. We need to name things, but we also need in naming to recognize that what we're naming often resists the name. Verbs are also acts of naming. We're naming what we're doing. When I run, I'm naming it, but the act of running is very different from a noun that confers a name on a person or an entire category. if we think of every noun as not a description of a thing or a human or an object, but rather as an attempt to describe an action that we can't ever quite pin down, because aren't all of us really not nouns but verbs? I'm unfolding through time. I'm changing as I move through space and time. The entire world is changing, no matter how imperceptibly, from second to second. All of us are verbs, not nouns. But if we believe that we can spatially freeze the world into a collection of objects that then can be categorically classified and understood on the basis of our classifications, then I think we're beginning to tiptoe into the realm of othering. And it's then a slippery slope from there into pathologization and the discourse of foreign bodies that my earlier books was attempting to shed light on.
Right. Great. That was so eloquent, especially the verb noun bit. I really enjoyed that. So our next question is from Lasya. She says, the conversation about associating disease with xenophobia is extremely enriching, and I understand how this can set notions about disease in general. However, if we look at India or the US today, our generation, being millennials, or probably even Gen X, do not have a generational memory of a real pandemic. How do you then think people end up associating diseases to the foreign? And how much does current socio-political atmosphere determine that discrimination?
Yeah, clearly a lot. And I think what we're seeing in this pandemic is not all of a sudden people linking ideas of disease and xenophobia. Rather, disease helps sharpen xenophobic ideas that were always there. In fact, one of the things that I found most disheartening about this whole COVID crisis is that the collective experience of a pandemic has in practice been anything but collective building in terms of our consciousness. It's really sharpened the edges of caste divides, communal divides, class divides. And I think one of the things that a pandemic can do is take a magnifying glass to a social formation and reveal some of its ugliest compulsions. Because in a time of pandemic, when people can't quite make sense of what's happening in the world, and that failure to make sense is compounded by anxiety about what's going to happen to me, might I get infected, what's going to happen to my family, what's going to happen to my parents, what's going to happen economically to my business, what's going to happen to the national economy, the global economy, the spiraling fear alights on ready-made hatreds that may have lain semi-dormant. I think in recent months they've been anything but dormant. But I've been surprised, horrified, by how many people I know who I regard as liberal, educated, informed people have responded to the pandemic not only in an utterly paranoid way. I can understand the fear, the anxiety, but they've been looking for people to blame. I don't know how many of you have the misfortune to be on RWA or neighborhood association WhatsApp groups or email threads. I'm on one, and you wouldn't believe the crap that is coming down the pike every hour from people in my neighborhood who are absolutely convinced that we need to seal off our Tony privileged colony, which is already a gated community, from everything that might come from the outside, especially Muslims. Now, this relates to something else that is giving me some cause for concern. I talked about the need for building a collective response to COVID. And part of what I implied by that was also experiencing ourselves as a collectivity. We're all in this together. We're all trying to make sense of this together. We're all trying to take sensible precautions together. We're all trying to avoid getting infected and avoid other people, hopefully, from not only infection, but the strife that the entire lockdown has produced. But when I talk about we're all in this together, that doesn't mean that lockdown means the same thing for everyone. What we're seeing is that lockdown means very different things for very, very different people, depending to a large extent on their class, even the language they speak. So lockdown for people like me who live in leafy South Delhi, it may be a nuisance. You know, I can't go out as often. I can't see my friends in person. I can't go running the way that I used to, and I get very upset about that. But these are just small nuisances. Lockdown for people in, say, Dharavi, the slums of Bombay, lockdown for people in northeast Delhi, destroyed in many parts by the rioting, lockdown for people who are living in very, very crowded and confined quarters means something very different. Lockdown for daily wage laborers means something very different. For these people, social distancing is simply not possible. They don't have access to hermetically sealed spaces where you can stay 2 meters away from others with clean bathrooms. They don't have gloves. They don't have masks. Lockdown actually increases the risk of exposure to disease and the possibility of infection. I think many rich people know this. And although there's a lot of chest thumping about how India has seen no community transmission, something I highly doubt, if there are 55 people already in Dharavi who have a coronavirus, and there isn't a whole lot of testing going on in this place with 8.4 lakh people in something like 2.8 hectares. The most densely crowded place in the world, I believe. It's hard to believe that community transmission isn't happening in quarters where there are 10 people living in a 10-foot by 10-foot space. I think rich people know this, and they are scared witless at the thought that people from the slums, people from crowded places, people who cannot practice social distancing might get into our spaces. And these people are being blamed. They're irresponsible, they're stupid, they're feckless, they're threats to our national effort to fight the coronavirus. So this is happening not just with the hashtag Corona Jihad canard. It's, I think, happening also along caste and class levels as well. It's something we need to be very mindful of. Again, we need to distinguish a scientific microbiological reality that certain people may be more at risk than others, from a whole moral discourse of blame, where we blame those who are more at risk and say there's something morally wrong with them, they need to be sealed up, they need to be not just quarantined, but they need to be drenched with bleach and their bodies, their rights absolutely violated. So that's what concerns me right now, that once again we're in the grip of a pandemic that is revealing what we already were prone to think about foreign bodies. I think it's no accident that in this, I've got to be careful about what I say because you never know who's listening, but where in a culture so deeply invested in ideas of shuddhata, in ideas of purity, which of course are informed by fears of untouchability and contaminating contact with those who are not from the right sort. The pandemic can bring all this stuff, which is not so dormant. It's still very much part of the fabric of people's lived reality outside of Delhi, outside of Bombay, outside of the cities, but also in the cities as well. That a pandemic brings all these phobias back into play, and this neat segue between the diseases of foreign body and the lower caste person, the Muslim person, the lower class person, as a foreign body all comes together.
Mhm. I think you also ended up answering one of the other questions we were asked. So this was by an anonymous attendee who said, what remains to be done when we're all being undone, Professor? And I think you certainly answered some part of that in saying that there's a project of collective building that needs to happen where we both acknowledge our shared vulnerability, but also the nuanced differences and don't resort to some kind of divisive agenda that we are already prone to. Like you say. But is there anything more you want to say on that? Otherwise, we can move on to the next question.
I mean, I wish I was a visionary. I'm just a scholar. And so what I do is I look at what's happened in the past in order to understand the present. I am a dreamer, which is not the same as a visionary, and I have blue sky dreams of a post-COVID world, which is not just COVID-free. In fact, I think that's an impossibility. We're not going to be COVID-free. It's going to be part of our viral fingerprint, our genome, now for eternity. But I think perhaps the way in which we understand ourselves in relation to other humans and in relation to the planet, I would hope that maybe we could do some fairly intensive rethinking. This may seem like a very sort of privileged dream, but I do think we all need to read more. And I'm very conscious of the fact that many people don't have access to the kinds of texts that I wish we could read more. We need to read more to learn about where we've come from. We need to read more in order to learn about where we're at now. We need to read more in order to learn about where we're going. And by reading more, I don't mean going to WhatsApp University to scratch the itch of hysteria, to scratch the itch of desire for instant, electrocuting horror about what might be coming up next. I really think we all need to digitally detox. And I need to take this advice myself because, as my partner keeps reminding me, I'm excessively addicted to my iPhone. But I need to unplug. We all need to unplug. We need to take a deep breath. And we need to read as a way of reconnecting with a larger world. And that larger world is not just the people living here in the present or the physical world we inhabit, which we also need to connect with. It's also the mass of learning that we have. As people have said, we are doomed to repeat history if we don't learn from it. There's so much history can teach us, but unfortunately we're living in a time when history is being compulsively rewritten by the powers that be, and magical thinking is taking the place of history as the preferred mode of engagement with the world, because it saves us the difficulty, the hard work of having to think. It's much easier if there are instant solutions, and blame, chest-thumping nationalism are instant solutions.
In the 3 seconds that I looked away from the question and answer box, it's really blown up. But Govind had asked a question quite a while ago that we have finally gotten to. Thank you for asking, Govind. He says, "Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for your wonderful. Thank you so much for a wonderful reading from your early work. You described how scientific discourse on foreign bodies percolates into xenophobic narratives. But I wonder to what extent does xenophobia on the one hand and the expulsion of lepers from within early modern city walls on the other influence our scientific understanding of the permeable human body?"
Yep.
And Govind, don't be sorry about the long and winding question.
Thank you, Govind. I feel like I'm back in the classroom with you, and that's a nice experience. I mean, there's so much to be said about leprosy, because leprosy in some ways was the disease out of which people's thinking at a popular and a scientific level, people's thinking about disease in general got shaped by responses to leprosy in the Middle Ages, not just in Europe, but in many parts of the world. And that continues to be the case in South Asia, in India. The fear of the leper, the fear of contact with the leper, is one that is deeply entrenched still. in a time when leprosy has been more or less wiped out in Europe and is receding more and more from public consciousness in India. I'll never forget a really disturbing experience I had in Agra in 2001, actually, the very first time I visited India. I was being driven around in relatively air-conditioned comfort in an ambassador taxi, being whisked like the Gora I was, from site to site, from Taj Mahal to Fatehpur Sikri to various other sites, the fort, etc. And we'd stopped off at one site, and suddenly the taxi, because people had seen there was a Gora in it, and they probably thought, we could make a killing. It was suddenly thronged by beggars. But then there was sort of a ripple of murmurs amongst the beggars, and they parted, and suddenly someone fell against the window next to me, very theatrically, and it was a leper who didn't have a nose, and much of their face was missing. And I even realized at the time this was, to a certain extent, a theatrical performance designed to get a response from me. But the leper sort of rubbed the screen of the window with his face. And he was playing on a cultural script. And the cultural script was, "You will be contaminated unless I go away." Meaning, please give me some money and then I'll go away, right? I mean, it's a really sad story. It's a story both of my privilege and of this person's absolute destitution. I think there's a way in which in India, leprosy and ideas of caste have overlapped in very powerful and noxious ways. And I don't know as much about this as I'm sure some of you might know. But the history of treating leprosy has, I know here, often hit the brick wall of certain assumptions about touchability and untouchability. I think there are very different histories of leprosy in Europe and India and other parts of the world. By the way, it was believed in Europe that syphilis started as a result of a leper and a Jew having sex. There you go. Two foreign bodies getting it on to produce a super foreign body. This sounds like something out of a Marvel comic. But that goes to show you how that xenophobic and pathophobic impulse really works hand in hand. The figure of disease and the figure of the foreign body, the Jew, literally mate in this instance. In the case of the subcontinent, it's the figure of a sick person and the figure of the untouchable that mates to produce the leper.
Yeah. So just before we move on to the next question, just to let everyone know that if you send me a question before 6:45, that's great. We'll be able to take it. If you send it to me after 6:45, it's going to be tight because we're trying to squeeze in a lot of questions. And everybody seems to have loved what you were saying and seems to want to ask you more. So that's great. Our next question is from Shreya. She says, loving it, feels a little like being back in class. Since we're talking about questions of identity, language, and the physical body, I can't shake the idea that it always comes down to the ideas of purity and impurity, whether of body, identity, ideology, or borders. Can we reflect on this by thinking about the figure of the witch? Does she become relevant and appear to us as we live through this pandemic? I seem to remember from personal experience that this is a topic explored in your book.
Yeah. Yes, so in Foreign Bodies and the Body Politic, I've got a whole chapter on witches and how witches were associated with disease. In particular, this may seem bizarre, but this actually resonates with what you were asking, Shreya, about the bodies of borders. It was believed that witches had tongues that were poisonous. This at least was in Britain. And that the tongue of a witch could be used to spread poison and sicken men in particular. And this ties with all sorts of wonderfully pathetic male phobias, that the poison of a witch's tongue could make a man's penis wither and fall off. Poor men. But the witch, as much as the Jew, was a sort of go-to scapegoat in times of disease. And King James, for instance, has a rather pathetic story to tell about his wedding night. So this is King James of Scotland and then later of England. He was Queen Elizabeth's successor in 1603. But he got married in Scotland in 1591. Now, King James was certainly sexually interested much more in men than in women. But he got married off to Princess Anne of Denmark in 1591. And there was apparently a great deal of excitement about escorting bonny Prince James to his nuptial chamber, King James as he was then, to his nuptial chamber with the Danish princess. And apparently something awful happened that night. And James resurfaced the next day looking a bit shaken. And he talked with a few people, and then he later appeared in the court and he said, "To this day, I'd never believed in witches, but now I know for a fact that they're true, that witches are real and witches can do evil things, because a witch did something to me on my nuptial night that stopped me from ... So it's hard not to speculate that King James attributed what he thought as erectile dysfunction to some evil witch, an outsider, rather than to the fact that he simply may not have been capable of being sexually aroused by a woman. So that's an interesting story of how an internal problem gets outsourced onto an easy external scapegoat. This is a common theme during not only pandemics, but even in times of relative social health, that internal problems over and over again get outsourced. And witches, who often constituted the most vulnerable sector of society, they were usually poor, illiterate, working class, or rather peasant class women, outside even the orbit of Christianity, because they came from pockets of England, Scotland, Wales, that Christianity hadn't fully penetrated into. They were easy, slim pickings for powerful figures like King James. So yes, and I think now it would be interesting to think about how much the word chudel is being used in the context of the corona and the coronavirus. I've no idea, but I'm sure that one needn't even think of chudels. I wouldn't be at all surprised right now if during lockdown, I said lockdown means different things to different people from different classes. I suspect it might mean different things to different genders too. Because I think behind closed doors, with a lot of frustrated men feeling disempowered for a variety of reasons, whether economically or socially, some pretty terrible things are happening to women. Women are being blamed, if not for the coronavirus, then at least for the ills at home. So the impulse to blame, I think, is so powerful, and it gets activated at a variety of levels during a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Great. So our next question is from Zico, and it resonates with another question that we got from Minashi. So I'm going to say both of them. I'll combine them together. Zico says there's a notion of communalization of the narrative. And one notion that the Goswami Bhakts of the country make regarding factual evidence, which is 33.33% of the spread can be traced to the Markas. How can we balance the so-called fact with communalization of the narrative? And adding to this, the refusal of protesters in Shahin Bagh to leave the site when things took a turn for the south. And Minakshi's question was just about the role of the media and whether you think the media is fanning the link between pandemic and xenophobia.
Well, frankly, the media was pretty toothless even before the pandemic began. It's even more toothless now because although I believe some reporters have special passes that allow them to travel and to report on site, most newspapers are facing an enormous crisis in terms of their financial viability. So they're laying off a lot of staff. If you subscribe to newspapers, at least the English newspapers that I subscribe to, English language newspapers, are becoming slimmer by the day. The Indian Express has shrunk to about 10, 12 pages. So there's not a great deal of reporting going on. We've also got, again, I've got to be careful about what I say, but we've got, shall we say, a government that broadcasts rather than consults. And we've got a fifth estate that is inclined to report the broadcasting as news rather than holding it up to critical scrutiny. So I think the media is certainly playing certain stories that it's being fed, and I think the media is also not digging deep enough in some areas. As far as, so that's Minakshi's question. As far as Zico's question is concerned, so I think we've got to be very careful when we start bandying around mathematical figures and making them do the work of scientific certainty. How do we know that a third of cases in India can be traced back to the Tablighi location? We don't. And why do we not know that, even though it's being touted over and over again? We have little tickers on TV news and in newspapers saying, here are the number infected, here are the number who have died, here are the number who are cured. Those numbers aren't accurate because, for the simple reason that testing has not been pervasive. And testing in certain parts of the country has not been pervasive. There are many areas in which I would suspect we need to do a lot more testing because we would find that there are many more cases. I suspect in Dharavi there are many more cases than 55, for instance. And so was it irresponsible to convene that particular meeting? Yes, it probably was. But does that mean that Muslims are responsible for a third of the cases of coronavirus? That is slipping a little bit. That is finessing, massaging the narrative in the direction of communalism without quite getting there yet. Really, what we're talking about is a third of the cases that have been tested. Now, the reason that they've been tested is because a decision was taken after the Tablighi affair came to light to do contact tracing. And there, it's hard not to think, oh, why has decision to I think that there should have been contact tracing, but why are we pursuing this one in particular and not other contact tracings? So, for instance, I heard recently that a defense colony, the story I was alluding to recently, where the Muslim chowkidar was blamed for infecting this family. In fact, the family had recently returned from overseas where they'd been to a puja. Has there been contact tracing through the puja? Are pujas contact traceable? I'm sorry to ask that question because it does seem to sort of beg the communal question. But right now there seems to be a sort of proliferating narrative that it's Muslims who spread the disease, not Hindus. Hindus are too pure. All the nonsense about how Gaumutra is going to protect us from infection. All this nonsense about how if we bang our talis, the clapping, according to Vedic knowledge, the sound, will kill the coronavirus dead because of the vibration. It will resonate with the Om vibration, which, as we know, purifies everything. there's so much magical thinking that is grounded in communalism masquerading as science. So be very, very careful before you take on board figures as absolute indexes of empirical truth. There always needs to be an asterisk, a but. There's always a story behind how the data has been gathered, to what ends it's been gathered, why it's been gathered this way. I'm not disputing that the virus has spread from Nizamuddin in horrific ways to people all around the country. The problem is when we translate that into an entire discourse of blame of an entire community. And when do we start losing compassion for people who get the disease? This is something that 21st century pandemic India has in common with 16th century pandemic England, by the way. People who got syphilis, people who got plague, were regarded as pariahs, as sinners who needed to be drummed out the community, just as lepers needed to be drummed out the community. People who have coronavirus, ditto. Unless they're very, very rich, and we know that they're safely quarantined at home. But even then, 2 days ago, there was another experience in my colony, horrific. Someone had had a quarantine notice plastered on their front door. A photo was taken of that quarantine notice after it had been detached and paraded through the entire colony with the name of the person under quarantine revealed in the photo and shared high and low with all people in the neighborhood with the caption, "COVID is loose. Shame on this person who has come back from overseas." Okay? It turned out that she hadn't come back from overseas, or rather she had come back from overseas, but she didn't have COVID. She tested negative for it. She was just performing a compulsory quarantine. But you can see how the hysteria builds up on the basis of labeling, on the basis of scientific testing. This is what we are being told in our neighborhood association group. She has been tested and she's positive. So be very, very wary when people wheel in science to prove their communal claims. Science is usually a fig leaf that is hiding something quite ugly.
Mm-hmm. So now we're just going to take 2 quick comments before moving on to our last question. So Kaveri just wanted to echo what you were saying. She says, Tablighi, Kumbh gatherings, pujas, and birthday parties that are being thrown by politicians. How many of the attendees of these other events are being tested? Yes. And infected people aren't the villains. They need more care than others.
Yes,
thank you,
exactly.
And Siddhant says, I think this is more of a comment than a question. He says, all personifications of the virus that I have encountered in the media have been female. It's always Miss Coronavirus and not Mr. Coronavirus.
Interesting.
So yeah, what you were saying earlier.
And even the depiction of the coronavirus, the depiction we're all used to with the little spores and spikes. There is a way, I think I've seen it being modeled as a sort of, as a woman's hairdo, as some sort of sci-fi futuristic Blade Runner android woman's hairdo. Yes.
I hadn't seen that, but I mean, now I have. So, okay, so let's move on to our last question. We have about 9 minutes to go, so that gives us enough time to address this and wrap it up neatly without running over time. This question is by Astha. She says, in the Indian context, we are already seeing a nationwide exercise to expel the foreigner through the CAA NRC. How far do you think the anti-Muslim wave funneled by the Hindutva government in the past few months led to the increased vilification of the Muslim community during the pandemic? Would the xenophobia and Islamophobia have been in any way different? Did we have a different government at the center? Or is xenophobia ingrained in our social fabric, so much so that who governs us during pandemics wouldn't have made a difference in our racist Islamophobic response to the disease?
Well, I'll answer that quickly. I think the events of the 3 months before the coronavirus, starting with the CAA and the NRC. I think before that, the events starting August the 7th in Kashmir. I think even before that, all the lynchings that have been going on. There's no doubt that, and again, I've got to be careful about what I say, but there's no doubt that we can see powerful forces behind an increasing national narrative of India as Hindustan. But that's not to say that this current dispensation invented all of this. And I think we've got to remember that, and I'm saying this as someone who loves India deeply. It's why I'm all the more heartbroken by what's been happening, not just since lockdown, but for a long time before that. I love India so deeply. I love its mixture. I love its capaciousness. I love the hospitality of India. But someone once said that the thing about India is it's so vast that every generalization you make about it with absolute conviction or authority can be contradicted by its complete opposite. So even though India is a land of mixture, of pluralism, of hospitality, it's also a land of purity, of singularity, of intolerance. And this long precedes 2014, 2019. You look at the Manusmriti, and you look at other forms of hatred. They've been dancing side by side with all the wonderful forms of inclusivity, syncretism, pluralism that have been part of the idea of India. So these are very, very deep wells that the current dispensation are dipping into. They aren't just going back to the Vedas. They're drawing on all sorts of other antique hatreds. And so I think we've got to be very careful not to fall into the trap of doing a counter version of what the current Sarkar does, which is to say, once upon a time there was a golden age before the Muslims came with their swords and terrorized Hindus and destroyed temples. Everything was okay in the age of the Vedas. We can't say, well, actually everything was okay until the British came along. There was Akbar and there was Dara Shikoh, and everything was wonderfully syncretic, but then the British came along with their policy of divide and rule and everything fell apart. All these narratives of once upon a time it was great and it fell apart, they may serve a certain political purpose in the present, but they always mystify the complexity of both the past and the present. And the fact is that for every Akbar and every Dara Shikoh, for that matter, Farishta Khan, you should read about him in the Bahmani Sultanates. He was another extraordinary syncretic figure, the Sultan of the Bahmani Sultanate, who studied, he was possibly born a Hindu, converted to Islam, studied Sufism, but also studied Judaism and learned to speak Hebrew. I mean, this is just an extraordinary syncretism. But side by side with the Farishta Khans, expressions of communal hatred, of caste privilege, of pariahification. And so we need to be aware that hatred has very deep historical roots. It's all the more reason to read history deeply in this wonderful opportunity we've been given to retire into our studies and read all these books and remember that they're not decorations, but receptacles of our many, many traditions of knowledge.
This is the perfect note to end on, especially
since that might be the case.
Yeah, I mean, especially since this has been a book club reading. But I just want to thank you and everybody who's stuck with us and for asking such thoughtful questions, and to you, Professor Harris, for your honesty. So yeah, that's all from me. If you, Professor Harris, or any of the attendees have any feedback for me, you can write to me at manjari@belongg with 2gs.net or contact @belongg, again with 2gs.net. And every week I'm going to be bringing sessions like this to you. So you will know about next week. So yeah, stay tuned, and thank you once again. Yeah, see you soon.
And thank you, everyone. It's so good to see so many familiar faces. Well, not see the familiar faces. I can't see the familiar faces. It's so good to see your icons, your presence here. It's much nicer to look at than looking at the reflection of myself in the laptop screen.
Yeah.
Lots of love to you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.